Welcome to the Happier and Healthier podcast. I'm your host, Maria Marlowe, and this is a place where we don't rely on good luck or good genes for our health and happiness, but rather we create it with our thoughts and our actions each and every single day. Each week, I'll bring you a thought or a guest that will help you live your happiest and healthiest life. Are you ready? Welcome back to the Happier and Healthier podcast. Today's guest is Cynthia Lee, MD, who is a traditionally trained medical doctor, but who went over to the other side and became an integrative and functional medicine doctor after dealing with a disabling autoimmune illness. Today, she's here to discuss her new book, Brave New Medicine, a memoir about dealing with her autoimmune illness, limitations of Western medicine, and her hard-won lessons on healing mind, body, and spirit. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to share with you about a couple brands that I love and help make this podcast possible. If you're looking to improve your health, and especially if you want to improve your digestion, you have to check out the probiotic brand Hyperbiotics. It's the most effective probiotic that I've found on the market, and it's a brand that I personally use and recommend to all of my clients. It's so effective because it's made with 15 different strains of probiotics that have been scientifically shown to benefit digestive and overall health, including weight management, reproductive health, and mood. They're also clinically shown to be 15 times more effective than the common probiotic capsules that you'll find at the health food store. Hyperbiotics has helped many of my clients and myself get rid of bloating, increase regularity, and maintain a flat stomach and healthy digestion. For being so high quality, you expect them to be super expensive, but they're extremely affordable at just $25 for a 1-month supply. Plus, you get an additional 20% off with the code HYPERMARIA. Head to hyperbiotics.com, that's HYPERBIOTICS.com, and use the code HYPERMARIA for 20% off. If you're looking for all-natural skincare products without harsh chemicals, useless fillers, or other nasty things you don't want in your bloodstream, check out Primally Pure. It's a California-based skincare line that started from a farm, so you can bet that all the ingredients are all natural yet extremely effective. I love their beauty cream, fancy face serum, and deodorant. Head to primallypure.com and use code MARIA10 for 10% off your order. Dr. Lee, thanks so much for being here.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
So I know that you now have an integrative and functional medicine practice, but you trained traditionally or initially as a traditional MD. So can you talk a little bit about what the turning point was? I know you talk about it in the book of what made you make that switch.
Yeah, I would say it was not enlightenment. It was really a breakdown, complete breakdown of my body. And I was about 3 years out from my residency training. So it was sort of at this place in my career where I felt a strong sense of mastery. You know, I knew all the research, the latest protocols, and I was feeling just a great sense of pride, but also, the sense of mastery. And it was at that time that my husband and I had our first child. And when she was about 4 months old, I developed postpartum thyroiditis, which is the postpartum form of Hashimoto's thyroiditis, an autoimmune condition of the thyroid gland. And then, long story short, in a couple of years during my second pregnancy, I developed a sudden onset of chronic fatigue syndrome and dysautonomia, which is a complete dysfunction of the autonomic nervous system, which controls vital but largely subconscious processes like blood pressure control, heart rate, digestion, breathing, body temperature. And so I often felt like I was on the verge of passing out. I have profound exhaustion, literally could not get off the couch. So it took about 2 years. As I trained as an internist, as an expert in chronic conditions. And these sets of conditions were not only ones I didn't know how to treat or that Western medicine had really no good remedies for, but I hadn't quite believed them to be real. I thought that there was a huge psychosomatic component to it. We had no way of measuring it. So it took me about 2 years of going on the merry-go-round of specialist to specialist before I realized I'm not going to get anywhere. And I was too tired actually to keep going on that merry-go-round. So I got off and was pretty much on my own. I knew vaguely about integrative medicine, just, some lifestyle changes, but I was too exhausted and too debilitated to do that. And I had 2 young kids. I did not know about functional medicine at the time, and I was very skeptical of anything alternative. So I really went back to my Pathology 101 textbook and went back to fundamentals and began to really dig deeper into how chronic diseases begin and how do they progress. So it was really going back to fundamentals that opened me to new ways of seeing and new questions to be asked.
Yeah, it's often in these times of crisis that wake us up, right? That have us look at the world in a different way. So sometimes the path seems a little rocky and unfortunate, but the clearing that it opens up is a million times better. And I'm sure now you're helping so many people with integrative medicine, functional medicine now. It's just unfortunate you had to go on that path. So in terms of getting a diagnosis, you had this mysterious illness, and you talk about in the book that you were labeled like a difficult patient. So tell us a little bit about that. And maybe for anyone who's listening who has either a mystery illness or who has been labeled a difficult case, what should they do?
I would say that no doctor outright called me a difficult patient, but I knew from my training that I had become one of those. And, it can really be anything from somebody with a really challenging and abrasive personality to someone who, like me and like millions, don't fit into the paradigm, right? So, God, we keep coming back and we keep coming back with more symptoms, and it begins to challenge the system. And what happens is that in the pressure of a 15, 20-minute appointment, then it's the patient who becomes difficult. Whereas, as you just said, it's actually a difficult case. And patients like me are coming back again and again because we are deeply suffering. The last place I wanted to be was in the doctor's office. So I remember that moment when I saw, it was in my endocrinologist's eyes, like, we were there was a little bit of tension in the visit, and I was actually presenting research that I had found about potentially foods that might be exacerbating my symptoms. And he just looked at me and said, your thyroid numbers look great. It's fine. And I saw reflected in his eyes, like, oh my God, I've gone to that other side, the bedside, and he's feeling tremendous frustration with me. And so it was this weird duality where I felt both helpless as a patient, but also I fully understood where he was coming from. So it was I myself who diagnosed chronic fatigue syndrome and dysautonomia. I remember I was in the bathroom and I was barely able to stand up after a shower. And I basically took my vital signs and realized that from simply just standing, I had taken a shower, rested because I was exhausted, and then got up and was taking my vital signs and just standing there for about 5 minutes. My heart rate went way up to about 140, as if I had just done a good run, and my blood pressure was tanking. And so I realized, oh my God, and that's one of the telltale signs of dysautonomia. It's out of sync with what it is that your body's actually doing. So I thought, oh my God, I've got that, and I've got chronic fatigue syndrome because it's been going on now more than 6 months. And, post-exertional malaise, the whole bit. And oftentimes people feel tremendous relief with a diagnosis, with a name. It makes it feel like there's something tangible to work with. And the way that I'd been trained, everything did hinge on the diagnosis, right? If you get a diagnosis of diabetes and you meet a certain lab criteria or a certain set of symptom criteria for other conditions, then we know what the treatment plans are. And all the studies are organized that way in terms of treatment arms, right? And how people do with this particular treatment versus that with a particular name. And the diagnoses of chronic fatigue syndrome and dysautonomia were quite the opposite. It was basically naming the symptoms that I had with no further answers. It was kind of like this aha moment, but it was very, very anticlimactic because then it was like, oh, well, now what? So knowing that there were no answers or very, very few answers, I knew that there were research centers that worked with chronic fatigue syndrome patients, but I was so brittle that there was no way I would be able to even follow through or undergo any more diagnostic testing. So it took me quite a while to get to the place of seeing an acupuncturist. But in my doctor's mind, the way that I approached it was, what can I do that is low risk, right? Something that is not going to set me back even further with a potential gain. I wasn't even going for high potential gain. I was just going for any kind of gain with low risk. And so it was a friend who really urged me to go into acupuncture. And because it was seemingly low risk, and there were some studies about fatigue and insomnia, which was a symptom that I was really struggling with, and, generalized achiness, that I thought, okay, you know what? I'm just going to give it a try, And my response to that was really profound. And it got me to the place where chronic vertigo was another one of my symptoms. And that, along with the exhaustion, was really what kept me housebound for a couple of years. And it got me to the place where the vertigo was good enough to where I could actually read books and I could go online without having worsening vertigo. So I began also at that time my own research into what was out there and what science was there.
Well, I think that is a great reminder that we should never give up, right? If you have some sort of mysterious illness, keep looking for answers, keep trying things. And that, yes, once you have that diagnosis, there's still more work to do. It's not always so easy, but if you keep searching, I feel like, you keep asking questions, eventually you'll start to figure things out. I think one door leads to another.
Right.
I do want to circle back to, you had mentioned that your blood work was normal, right? Your thyroid looked normal, but obviously something was wrong. So can you talk a little bit about why blood tests are in the normal ranges, why they don't always give us a great accurate reading of our health?
Yeah. And, the other thing, my thyroid levels were normal. I still had all of my hyper and hypo, the overactive and underactive thyroid symptoms, like sort of all bundled together. And also my screening labs were normal, the kind of standard complete blood count, the liver screen, the chemistries, the urinalysis, what most people get if they go to the doctor, whether for a regular checkup. All of those were not with the normal range, but when I look back on it, when I was writing my book, I went really back into my records and examined things, and they were, pristine numbers. It wasn't even just, they were a little bit out of whack. They looked like someone who was incredibly healthy. And so the disconnect was very profound for me. And I thought, God, as a doctor, when I look at these labs, I would certainly not correlate with someone who is debilitated. So it was humbling because, so often I rely on diagnostics, or when I was working at the time, had relied on diagnostics to reassure me about how patients were doing. And what's more important is really what they're experiencing and the quality of their life. So the challenge with lab tests is that, first of all, they're taking a snapshot just at the time that you had it drawn, which is limiting. The second piece is that a lot of patients, and this goes back to your earlier question about what do patients who have these mystery symptoms, what can they do? The reason why, and I don't even like the term alternative, but modalities that are outside of the classical Western medicine paradigm, why they approach and have much better results with these kinds of mystery illnesses is that they approach the body really as a whole ecosystem. And not just the body as an ecosystem, but there's an ecosystem within and on us, right? With the gut flora and the viruses and the parasites and the yeast and the bacteria. And then also we're living within ecosystems around us. So, our zip code, there's that saying that, right? The zip code matters more than genetic code. So what kind of environmental exposures am I getting to chemicals and pollutants? What kind of access to fresh food do I have? Am I getting enough movement in my day-to-day life? And just to say nothing of stress, just what is the day-to-day, minute-to-minute milieu of my existence? So these ancient paradigms, like traditional Chinese medicine or Ayurveda, those are two more well-known traditions, but like naturopathy is another one that's a little bit more contemporary. And now functional medicine. So functional medicine is really applying the same systems approach. So an example would be my thyroid was out of whack in the beginning. It's not just my thyroid gland. It's actually my entire hormonal system that was out of balance. And then it was manifesting largely in my thyroid gland. And that's connected to my immune system, right? This is an autoimmune condition. And then the immune system and the hormone system are connected to the neurological system, to our digestive systems. So all of these systems are a little bit, or sometimes a lot, out of balance, and they're pulling on each other. And so with the Western medicine approach, we tend to isolate and want to treat one thing. But you've got all these other systems that are needing support and needing tweaking as well. And so when we approach the patient much more holistically, the healing happens often kind of as a side effect. We're sort of treating the whole patient. If I, for example, prescribe a particular diet for a patient or a particular mind-body practice for a patient, they're focused on what they're doing, but it's addressing and sort of righting multiple systems at once. So the healing becomes much deeper and much more comprehensive. To say nothing of the fact that these modalities really encourage the patient to get much more in touch with themselves. I mean, I think that's the most healing of all, is to get back into your body, reconnect with it, in a compassionate way, which is really the root of healing.
Yeah, I think it's so true. I think we do get so disconnected from our body. And, I think sometimes we're relying on, other people like doctors, to tell us what's wrong or tell us what's going on in our body. Meanwhile, our body is giving us all these signals all day long and we're completely ignoring them, Yeah, I think it's really, really important that we get back in touch with our body and start listening to it. Also start talking to it a little bit more nicely than most of us do. And yeah, I think that's really where healing starts. But I'm curious, because you're saying this, that getting in touch with your body and self-reflection, that's really important. Where does trauma and stress, what role does that play in autoimmune disease?
Yeah, trauma is a really big factor. And it's a delicate topic to broach because of this notion of psychosomatic. People often say, oh, well, you just said that, it's not in your head, but now you're saying that there's a lot of trauma that happened, And so when we say, oh, God, it's not real, it's in their head, I mean, we're really suggesting that there's some imaginary component to it, right? Like we're sort of almost willing it to happen for secondary gain of some sort. And trauma is a very different thing. And there's a lot of data now, and it's been around for decades, but it's really kind of coming to the forefront now about childhood trauma and how within these formative years, it doesn't even have to be overt violence per se, but perceived trauma. And so there are children, for example, who are just very sensitive, are more sensitive to negative influences or to an authoritarian parent than their sibling. And what it does is it sets up patterns in the stress system, in the hormone system, in the neurological system, and then in the immune system. It sort of gets primed, and then they learn how to cope. They're young and they're in survival mode. So what happens is you go into a fight or flight mode and you don't even know it because it's all you've known. It's a little bit pre-conscious in a way, but it becomes sort of the default way in which your body, the inner workings, are relating to the external world. So then later in life, let's say there's multiple and oftentimes there's multiple triggers. And, and I remember when I was writing my book and living back into the timeline of my illness and healing journey, the thyroiditis seemed to come out of nowhere. I mean, I was like really healthy, quote unquote. And then the chronic fatigue syndrome and the dysautonomia hit very abruptly on a trip to Beijing. And what I know now is that while the manifestations of those diseases were abrupt for me, that there were imbalances going on for a long, long time. And I could use hindsight then to realize, oh, you know what? diseases often begin as subtle imbalances several years, sometimes decades before the disease can be diagnosed. So I was going back in time into my residency training and just how completely stressful that was. You know, it's a trauma, as you're saying, it's a trauma of sorts. So you're going through medical boot camp. I also had a relationship then, that a man that I was engaged to, and a big tragedy happened. And it was incredibly stressful. And so that can be aggravations on top of an immune system and a hormone system that's already been sort of primed by stress. You know, and then you add that to genetic susceptibility to autoimmunity, and then you kind of get the perfect storm.
I know, I think so many of us go through traumas and through stress, and it's probably a miracle that more people don't have these these issues. But that kind of brings up the point that there are multiple factors typically involved in the development of any chronic illness, and especially autoimmune. So one thing that I know that's very popular now and is talked about a lot is this autoimmune paleo protocol in terms of diet. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on that, and what dietary changes that you made and that you think are really beneficial for those that are suffering from autoimmune issues.
Yeah, so the first place always to start is food. And food is actually, it's hard. It's hard to change your diet. It's hard to do any lifestyle changes, but it's easier than, for example, going right in and dealing with your trauma, your trauma.
For sure.
So yes.
Just eat some kale, like baby steps.
Exactly. And so, you know, one of the ways is really, how do we fortify the physical body to get to a place where then we can begin to, what I call, detox the soul. Like, and again, I will just say, because we were talking about trauma, my way was not through psychoanalysis. It was not through so much even confronting the traumas as it was just to understand, oh, I can go to like a grief ritual. Oh, I can do mind body practices that literally release and change the way that my DNA is folded, so that it's physically kind of at the cellular level releasing trauma. So you sort of bypass, you know, years and years of
okay, wait, before we talk about diet, let's talk about this. So what are some of these practices then to release the trauma that you found effective?
Yeah, so for me, and it's going to be different for everyone, but for me, it was really going into a mind-body practice called Qigong. And again, I didn't enter it thinking I was going to do trauma work. I was doing it because, oh, okay, I need to rehabilitate my inner workings. And the only way to do that, right, is by doing mind-body practices. And I was trying to also increase my mitochondrial, you know, those are the powerhouses of our cells. I was trying to increase the mitochondrial efficiency. So it was very scientific. My approach was very clinical. But the longer I was doing the Qigong practice, Qigong is a moving meditation that is the foundation of Tai Chi and martial arts and traditional Chinese medicine. But there's three components. There's the movement part, there's the meditation and consciousness work, and then there's sound vibrations. So sort of like, you know, the way chanting is, you know, people do it in different traditions. And the vibrations actually, together with the movements, they begin to they rewire the way that my brain was wired. So changing the neuronal connections to a healthier pattern, or I would say out of the chronic illness pattern, chronic inflammatory pattern. And, you know, there's no data on this right now, but the longer I practiced it, I realized, oh my God, that's actually what it's doing. What it felt like it was doing was changing the way the DNA folded and unfolded, which we know through the science of epigenetics. And we know through some population studies in humans, but largely from animal studies, that patterns of trauma can get passed down genetically in the way that the DNA is folded through generations. And so I felt like through the chanting and the movements that I was releasing trauma that actually wasn't even mine, that I had kind of inherited, right? My parents survived wars. My grandparents, you know, they were parents during the wars. And there was tremendous trauma and sort of this fight or flight mode of living. And then the other thing that helped me was grief work, was not processing mentally the grief, but I went to a grief ritual. And again, it's a somatic, it's a visceral response, you know, it was the first place I've ever been where they encouraged us, or not only gave us permission, but encouraged us to cry. And grief is it's not discriminating. Like, it doesn't matter what I thought I was going there for, which was actually my health, the breakdown of my body and the years that I lost. But, all this stuff from even my childhood came up when I was there. So I just felt like it was like a detox. I felt like, oh, I just did a massive detox. And in the spaciousness that opened up, empathy, confidence, compassion, peacefulness, these qualities that we associate with resilience, they filled up that spaciousness, as a side effect. So I did not, it wasn't like, oh, I suddenly decided I was going to get self-agency and then become resilient. It was really, there was no room in me. So it was about, how do I let go? How do I clear my body and my soul to make room for healing to happen naturally?
It's so interesting. I think a lot of us walk around with these weights on us, right? And these stressors and these things that have happened again from childhood. It could be decades later now. And we just don't realize it. We just are unwell in some way, or just something is off, or our mood, we're moody, or we're crying, or there's stuff going on. And you're just like, why is this happening all the time, right? And it's because we haven't processed and dealt with that stuff from the past. And it's interesting you even brought up the epigenetic part. Well, maybe it's not even your trauma. Like, maybe it's your parents' trauma, which is sort of mind-boggling to think about. But then when you think further, it all makes sense. So, I mean, both of these things sound very interesting. I haven't tried either, but after this, I think maybe I will.
Yeah, it's really powerful. And from a clinical standpoint, it's just so much faster. Which is wonderful.
Yeah,
but it's faster because it's deeper.
Right.
It's just a deeper release. It's stuff it's stored in our bodies. And so, like, the only way to release that is actually not through the mind. It's through something that's going to engage the body.
Well, even
something visceral.
Yeah, and they even talk about dancing, how dancing is very healing.
Absolutely.
It's just moving the body. Mm-hmm.
Yep. And dancing is another, and I have a lot of patients who do that. Yeah. Or even like laughter yoga,
Mm-hmm.
It seems almost opposite of going to a grief ritual, laughter yoga, but it's a visceral response. And going to a grief ritual is not going to be for everybody.
Yeah.
So, you can opt for laughter yoga, but it has to be something that's where you're inhabiting your body.
Yeah.
So there's lots of avenues. And, and another way, going back to your other question, is healing the gut. Like, when we heal the physical body, we actually heal emotions as well. They really go hand in hand.
So talk a little bit more about that, because we do know that leaky gut is pretty much believed to be associated with all forms of autoimmune conditions, and it's sort of the predecessor. So talk a little bit about that, and let's get back into the diet. Like, what causes leaky gut, and then what steps do we take to heal that?
Yeah, there are a lot of factors that can cause leaky gut. Leaky gut is basically, the epithelium, the barrier in the gut where we're absorbing nutrients, and we're colonized, right? Where we've got this rich micro ecosystem of microorganisms that are helping us digest and metabolize and absorb. But they're the keepers of the gut lining. So when this micro ecosystem is out of balance, we can almost look at it almost like a monoculture. Let's just say, the garden of our gut has become sort of like a monoculture. And, what we want is, just like in a garden that we can see and tend, we really want a rich diversity. And that's really what confers resilience, right, to a system, is this diversity. So multiple factors can cause the gut flora to go out of balance. Emotional stress is one big one. Chemicals, pesticides, medications, processed foods, again, monoculture foods. So if we're sort of eating a lot of things that are processed, wheat and corn derivatives, it can all contribute to it. I don't know anybody who is not exposed to those things. And hormones can contribute too. So there's a lot of factors, infections, but we usually have a reserve, and it's just like having another acute stress. We can get over it. It's when the stress becomes chronic or perpetual So you're constantly, right, bombarding the gut with chemicals and with medications and with stress and with whatever it is that we're going to put in there physically and emotionally. So then the keepers of the gut lining are out of balance. And what happens is then lots of particles that are food or non-food are then crossing that barrier. And flooding right outside that barrier is the vast majority of our immune system. They're sitting there in lymph nodes, sort of waiting. And they're learning, actually, what they're doing is they're going to school there. They're learning what is self, what is myself, and what is a foreign, or not even just a foreign protein, but what is a harmful foreign protein, right? I mean, the immune system is so sophisticated where they actually know like which microorganisms are beneficial and which ones are harmful. So what happens is that the immune system gets overwhelmed, right, by the amount of inflooding of this molecules. And so it actually begins to rev up and go into overdrive. And that's really what autoimmunity is an immune system that's gotten hyped up and then is now starting to get confused, right? Certain sequences in the protein of gluten, for example, are very, very closely linked to certain sequences in the thyroid gland. So oftentimes it's called molecular mimicry. The immune system gets confused and now they're actually meaning to attack the gluten. Now they're attacking the thyroid gland. So the leaky gut or intestinal hyperpermeability is a really big target, the first target for healing of autoimmunity and actually any other chronic disease. And this is it's a new concept sort of scientifically, but Hippocrates back a couple of millennia ago, right, was saying that all diseases begin in the gut. And this is also a paradigm that Ayurveda, Chinese medicine, naturopathy have been doing for a long time.
And that's just it. When you go to like a Chinese medicine doctor or an Ayurvedic doctor, I think a lot of times people don't realize that Ayurveda is actually a form of medicine. In the US, it's sort of like a spa treatment, whereas in India, they go to full-on medical school, and that is the traditional, the medicine there. And when you go to one of these practitioners, and the first things that they'll tell you is to make dietary changes, right? Based on whatever your condition is. So it's it makes sense. Like it's always going back to food and to the gut health.
Absolutely. And so, yeah, you mentioned paleo diet. And, I have to admit, and this goes contrary to a lot of my colleagues, that I'm not a huge fan of it. I have recommended it for some patients as an initial starting point. But first off, I'm just full confession, I was a patient as well as a doctor. That is not something that I could have done long term. I also don't believe that it is something that is meant to be done long term because it tends to diminish significantly the diversity of foods that people are eating. So if someone is doing autoimmune paleo diet, which, by definition is basically no grains, autoimmune on top of that is like no eggs, some people, no nightshades, right? And it's pretty hardcore. So if someone is able to do that and not be chronically stressed out about it or socially, or feeling socially isolated, and they're able to maintain a wide variety of just diverse foods, I think it could work. But when someone comes to me and they've been on it already for 2 or 3 years, 5 years sometimes, what it tells me is that there's a root issue that's still not being addressed. Like, I don't think you need to be on it forever or even for years if we're addressing the root causes. So then that's when I'll go into really looking at, are there stealth infections going on? Is there a parasite that's just in the gut that's hanging out, that's not enough to really cause any digestive symptoms, but is enough to just keep causing imbalance and inflammation? And biofilm, this is another thing that's been coming up a lot, is, it's the stuff like plaque on teeth or mucus in the sinuses, right? There's this film that's in the gut that pathogens, that harmful microorganisms hide out in, as well as beneficial ones. And Do we need to do a little bit of biofilm disruption? And, and a lot of the nutrients that are beneficial, again, in other ways, like quercetin is one, L-theanine is one. They're also N-acetylcysteine, which is a potent antioxidant. They actually can work on the biofilm as well. So oftentimes we're already doing that. Patients just aren't aware of it.
Mm-hmm.
So that said, the autoimmune paleo diet and ones like it can be really beneficial as a detox and as a gut healing protocol. So usually what I do with my patients is, and again, it totally depends on what they're able to do, their resources, their support, their personal knowledge coming in to see me. But I usually have them start with a general paleo diet. So, all right, can you do 30 days of a paleo diet, right? Just no grains, right? No sugars, no alcohol, no caffeine, really increasing the healthy natural fats and really increasing the variety of whole foods, vegetables, fruits. And oftentimes that's enough. And for me, I guess that was the closest diet that I had tried when I was really healing. And then after the initial, I did that for about 3 months. And then after that, I continued to stay gluten, dairy, soy, and egg free. So, it's kind of close to an autoimmune paleo diet, but I began introducing grains that were non-gluten and I've continued on that particular diet. So it's going to vary. And yeah, I do a lot of variability with my patients.
I think it's great that you bring that up because I think when dealing with something like autoimmune, there's not a one-size-fits-all treatment plan. Mm-hmm. And it is important to find a practitioner such as yourself who can really dig deeper and understands that there's multiple different factors involved and try to work on each of these things and not to get discouraged or feel like there's only one way to heal. Oftentimes there's a little bit of leeway and multiple different ways that you can find the solution and heal and get better.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So you also talk about intuition in the book. So why is that important? And tell us more about that. What is your definition of intuition?
Yeah, intuition, that was one that completely came out of left field for me. Intuition has been used and misused, I would say, so many times. But the definition I like the best came from the HeartMath Institute out of Silicon Valley. And they do really cool experiments on things like, the electromagnetic field of the heart and how does that affect someone, your own, but also someone else's brain waves. It's really sort of a scientific method into understanding things that we can't quite see. So I've just loved them, for their research. But they had a definition of intuition that was something about a certainty of knowing that is beyond the standard cognitive processes. And that is more based in sensations in the body that then guide this knowing. So again, it kind of goes back to this visceral experience and tuning back into the body. And the reason why I even went into intuition was because a friend of ours had come to stay with us. She was psychic. She was clairvoyant. We knew this about her, but had never gone there. Just, I was skeptical and, who needs to hear those kinds of stories? And I was also a little bit freaked out. I was just freaked out because it was so outside of my worldview. And she actually helped, quote, diagnose something that was going on with my younger daughter at the time. She was having night terrors. And Pia, this friend, kind of, quote, saw, what was going on. And she helped clear the energy. And my daughter's night terrors, which had been going on for months, stopped in an instant. So I had asked her, I didn't know, first of all, that intuition was something you could develop. I didn't know it was something like art or music, where some people are born gifted, but the vast majority of us are kind of under this bell curve, and we can learn no matter where we begin on that bell curve. I was more asking her, hey, if you could kind of clear that energy, can you help sort of clear the energy that's in my body? I had no clue, but I thought I would just take a stab at it because, again, it was low risk, right? So she said, well, it doesn't quite work that way in the body, but what I can do is I can teach you how to develop your intuition. So that's really how that journey began. And, the first thing, which was the hardest, I think, was learning to quiet my analytical mind, which is also the judgmental mind, and the mind that really likes to define and identify and diagnose. I was horrible at sitting meditation, and my mind was just way too active. And that's actually how I got into Qigong, was, there's actually meditation that's moving, where I can focus my mind on movements, and it gave my mind something to do. But my impetus for developing my intuition was that I had suddenly gone from conventional medicine, which had no answers for my conditions, to integrative and functional medicine, which was incredible, but it had an infinite number of possibilities of things to try. Which supplements do you do? Which vitamins? God forbid, which diet, right? So the intuition, I felt like, was helping me to hone in a little bit more efficiently on, well, which path do I take? And, what I've learned now in working with patients, I've been doing functional medicine now for about 7 years. Timing matters so much as well. So like maybe vitamin C for you is not great because your gut can't handle it. But, lo and behold, 6 months later, you know what? You really need vitamin C, and you can do it at higher doses. So the longer I've learned to practice and develop my intuition, and I pair it always with my analytical mind, right? So I think of it just as we have two eyes to see deeper and broader. And that intuition is just it's my right brain that then pairs with my left brain. And can I see more deeply and more accurately into what's going on, not just for myself, but with my patients as well.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And so the title of the book is Brave New Medicine. I'm curious what's behind the title.
Yeah. So the title originally was pitched to me when I was writing. I had no title. I wasn't even sure I was going to publish. And I thought, oh God, no. I said, well, you know what? The thing that comes for me is Brave New World, is this dystopia of what is modern healthcare. So it was a negative connotation as much as I love Aldous Huxley. But then the other piece that I was cautious about was that it sounded so certain. And I said, there's so much uncertainty. Even with functional medicine, there's a lot of uncertainty. So when I began to bring in the intuition piece and going into this whole new world that was new and scary for me, and it sort of embraced the uncertainty. It actually uses the uncertainty as a form of, strangely, certainty, that I began to embrace this title. I thought, oh, you know what? It's brave, not because it has all the answers, but because we're walking into uncharted territories. And a lot of times that uncharted territory is ourselves, is our body. And how do we go in there? How do we learn to listen? And how do we find out things about ourselves that are kind of scary, that are parts of ourselves that we don't want to see? So that's where that name came from.
I love that. No, it's a powerful name. It's a powerful name.
Oh, thank you.
So one last question that I like to ask everyone on the show is, if you can leave our listeners with just one tip or one piece of advice for them to live a happier and healthier life, what would that be?
I'd have to go back to inhabiting your body, reconnecting. And, along with that is, one of the threads I really explored in my book, and which is why I decided to write a memoir as opposed to a how-to book, because there were these philosophical and sort of existential threads that could really only be told through a story and through, sort of the longitudinal evolution of my thoughts. It's about belief, and how belief can either trap us or it can really liberate us. And, the hardest part of healing, I think, is also the simplest, which is believing that it's possible. And again, if we go into the body, our left brains can remain skeptical. I'm still a skeptic, but going into the body sort of bypasses that skepticism and allows the healing to happen.
I love that. Well, thank you so much for being here. The title of the book is Brave New Medicine, and it's available in bookstores everywhere and Amazon. I'll link to it. You can also learn more at Cynthia Lee, that's LIMD.com.
Thank you so much.